The final example in our study of courage is that of Daniel, and this lesson today is going to focus on the courage that he demonstrated in his willingness to violate the laws of men in order to be faithful to the Lord. You may remember in Daniel 6 verses 6 through 10 where King Darius was commissioned by some of his advisors to erect a statue of himself and demand that all of the Hebrews were to worship this statue. Well, Daniel refused to do so. And we remember the story that ensued, how Daniel was thrown into a den of lions, and there God spared his life. Friends, we understand that persecution in some form is a certainty for Christians, as evidenced by passages in the New Testament. Often the severest persecution will come from the civil authorities, and this can be carried out in one of two ways. Either there will be evil rulers targeting Christians, or there will be evil men with influence over unprincipled and or ignorant lawmakers that will manipulate the rulers into targeting Christians. There are times in which Christians need to defy the law and suffer persecution in order to remain faithful to God. Peter famously said, "We must obey God rather than men," Acts 5 and verse 29. Christians have generally enjoyed peace in this country, but as more evil men gain power and influence, our days of peace and freedom may very well be numbered. We need to be prepared to disobey the civil authorities if such becomes necessary in order to remain faithful to God. And Daniel's example shows one with the courage to defy the law when it became necessary to do so. When Daniel refused to bow to the statue of King Darius, he knew that he was breaking the law. He knew that this was in opposition to the laws of the land. Daniel knew that this law had been signed, and he disobeyed anyway, refusing to alter his service to God to conform to an ungodly decree. And when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered into his house, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Now when his enemies reported this defiance to the king, Darius tried unsuccessfully to rescue Daniel. And after Daniel was cast into the lion's den, Darius found him still alive in the morning. Daniel was delivered from the den, and his accusers were cast into the lion's den. Darius learned from this event and issued a decree recognizing the greatness and the supremacy of God. But why did this take courage on the part of Daniel? First, he knew that this law had been signed, and this was not a law that he violated in ignorance, which could have allowed him to plead for leniency when he was brought before the king. But this was an act of deliberate defiance against the law. Second, the penalty included certain death. Of course, death was only certain from a human perspective, ignoring the possibility of divine intervention. But it's interesting that Darius expressed confidence, or perhaps a hopeful desire, that God would deliver Daniel. But nothing is mentioned about what Daniel thought would happen. We learned yesterday from the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that God's people should have absolute faith in his power, but also recognize that God will not always act according to their desires. Daniel had to recognize that God could have allowed him to be killed in the lion's den. Third, this was a short-term challenge. The law prohibiting men from petitioning any god or man besides the king would only be enforced for 30 days. Daniel could have reasoned that rather than facing death for violating the law, it would be better for him to compromise his faith for 30 days and then return to serving God as he had done previously when the law had once this law had expired. Fourth, he did not go into hiding. Instead of closing his windows and trying to go unnoticed, Daniel kept the windows open while he prayed. He could have tried to avoid trouble, but he didn't. Fifth, the king signed the law. Daniel had a good relationship with King Darius up to this point, but even though the king did not write the law, he did sign it into effect. And there was no guarantee as to how he would react when he learned of Daniel's disobedience. He could have had sympathy for Daniel since the law was unfair, or he could have responded with anger for Daniel's open defiance to the law that he signed. Human reactions are often unpredictable as they're affected by a myriad of factors. Daniel chose to be faithful without regard to how King Darius would react. As society today becomes more ungodly, persecution against Christians, particularly from the government, will become more common and more severe. And unless our country undergoes a significant change in direction, then we must prepare for such persecution in our own future. Daniel's deliberate defiance of the law of man in order to remain faithful to God is an example that we need to remember today. And no matter what laws may be passed or what penalties may be imposed on Christians for following the Lord, we must always be willing to echo the words of Peter. We must obey God rather than men. Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today, and have a blessed day.